The past is often romanticized. We imagine the world of our ancient ancestors as a time of pure survival, a simple existence ruled by the hunt and the gathering of food. A world before war, before mass violence, before the horrors that would come with civilization. But what if that idea was incorrect? 10,000 years ago, the shores of Lake Turkana were a veritable Garden of Eden. Lush landscapes stretched as far as the eye could see, teeming with life. The lake itself was a hunter-gatherer's dream. Plants to gather, schools of fish, and turtles basking in the sun. People had been thriving at Lake Turkana since the dawn of humanity. But beneath the beauty of this so-called Eden, a darkness was stirring. A darkness as old as humanity itself. At a site we now call Naturuk, something terrible would happen. An entire band of hunter-gatherers was wiped out in a merciless attack. Men, women, and children were slaughtered without mercy. Some were struck down as they stood, others were bound and executed. This was not just a battle, it was an atrocity. This discovery forces us to ask some difficult questions. Were our ancestors truly peaceful, or has violence been a part of the human condition since the very beginning? What compelled these hunter-gatherers to act with such brutality? This is the story of Naturuk, a prehistoric massacre that shatters our assumptions about the origins of war. We will be analyzing the remains found at the site and recreate the weapons used to understand what might have motivated such a conflict. This is a mature scientific discussion of the remains at this archaeological site, so hopefully YouTube will have some mercy with me, unlike what was given at Naturuk. What happened here? Who were the attackers? And why did this brutal event take place? In the modern day, Lake Turkana is the largest desert lake in the world, surrounded by harsh, arid terrain. But it wasn't always this way. 10,000 years ago, the surroundings were incredibly lush. Herds of large herbivores roamed the grassy shores, while predators like lions and hyenas stalked in the shadows. And the lake itself was full of resources to gather and fish to hunt. Amongst this abundance, hunter-gatherers set up temporary camps, as at Naturuk, where they fished with barbed bone harpoons and hunted with stone tools. But in this veritable Garden of Eden, the darker side of humanity would find a way to show itself. The site of Naturuk was discovered in 2012, when fragments were found on the surface. Archaeologists quickly found that they had their work in for them, as the remains were distributed over a vast area. After a grueling excavation in the arid climate, they had found the remains of 27 individuals dating between 10,500 to 9,500 years ago. Many were preserved in the very positions they had died due to the quick preservation provided by the lake. 20 of them were adults, 1 a teenager, and 6 were young children. 12 of the skeletons remained in the very spot they fell, left unburied to the elements. 10 of the unburied skeletons show direct evidence of violence, mostly in regions such as the head, neck, ribs, and hands. The evidence suggests that these wounds would have been quickly, if not immediately, fatal. 2 of the skeletons had projectiles associated with them, one of which was embedded in the side of the skull. 7 cases consist of blunt or sharp force trauma to the head, and 2 cases consist of sharp force trauma to the neck. 2 other cases include blunt force trauma to the knees and 1 to the ribs. And lastly, there are 2 cases of fractures to the hands, typical of interpersonal violence. Only 2 of the skeletons in situ show no apparent evidence of violence, though in both of these cases, their hands appear to have been bound. Tragically, one of these victims included a young woman who was heavily pregnant. These individuals may have been drowned or dispatched in some yet unknown method. In order to get a deeper understanding of what this prehistoric attack may have looked like, let's examine the evidence of weapons found at the site and recreate and test them. The injuries were caused by 3 types of weapons: sharp, stone-tipped projectiles, some kind of heavy club, and also a club that seems to have had hafted stone blades capable of deep cuts. These weapons were seemingly created specifically for violence, as clubs and stone-bladed clubs have limited effectiveness for hunting or fishing. The attack consisted of the use of arrows at a distance combined with close-range melee weapons. In order to understand these weapons, I was compelled to recreate them. 5 or 6 of the wounds were caused by sharp implements which impacted the head and neck. These were in all likelihood caused by arrows. 3 stone artifacts with impact damage were found within or directly embedded into skeletons. The first and most telling was an obsidian bladelet found embedded in a male crania. It appears to have been the tip of an arrow. Bladelets are simply long flakes taken off of a core of obsidian. This one was then retouched to make it fit an arrow shaft more effectively. This design takes advantage of obsidian's absurdly sharp edge. In fact, obsidian is far sharper than any steel blade, coming to only about a dozen atoms thick at its edge. By making a long blade, you take advantage of this razor-sharp edge. These arrowheads are also quite easy to make, perfect for mass-producing ammunition. Obsidian was relatively rare in other sites of the region, possibly suggesting that a hostile group came in from elsewhere. I created some replicas of the Naturuk arrows, and I will be testing them on this piece of meat to see just how deadly these projectiles would have been. The obsidian bladelet penetrated deeply into the meat, but unfortunately the slow-mo footage got corrupted. The other 2 stone points found within one of the Naturuk skeletons were microliths, one made of chert and one made of obsidian. They were found inside the pelvic and thoracic cavities of a male skeleton. These were of particular interest to me. They could have been hafted in a variety of ways. Chisel-like stone arrowheads were used around the world. Though they aren't necessarily pointy, they provide a massive flesh wound. The chisel arrowhead penetrated deeply and split the shaft of the arrow in the process. Still, it created a devastating flesh wound that would have caused heavy blood loss. You can also see that the wound was filled with glue and obsidian shards that would have caused infection. It is also possible that these microliths were hafted on the sides of some large composite arrow or spear. Such a weapon would have left a horrible injury. And we know just how bad this would have been because a European man was once speared by an Australian Aboriginal death spear in his vitals. Death spears consisted of a spear shaft with small but razor-sharp flakes of stone hafted laterally. These stone flakes cut their way into the body and often fall off, leaving an incurable injury. In order to test this out, I'll be using this example on some ballistics gel. I ran at the target and thrusted. Blades became embedded in the gel and the point penetrated deeply. It is clear that this wound would have been a fatal injury. It is possible that similar weapons were used at Naturuk. Lastly, we have evidence that clubs were used to devastating effect against these people. There are 5 cases of blunt force trauma to the head, 2 fractures to the knees, 2 cases of fractured hands, and 1 of fractured ribs. The characteristics of the lesions demonstrate that at least 2 different sized clubs were used, meaning more than one attacker was likely carrying them and they varied. Clubs can be simply made of any substantially sized piece of wood or even bone, though it is known from ethnographic studies that clubs are often carved into more deadly shapes. Some even form blade-like edges, and if the wood is hard enough, it can easily cut through flesh and even bone. Heavy blunt force clubs were certainly used at Naturuk, though so were more unique cutting varieties. Deep cuts found on some skeletons suggest that stone blades were hafted onto the clubs. I created 2 varieties of this concept, one that resembles a stone fighting pick used by Australian Aboriginals, and another one with multiple hafted stone flakes. These are very clearly capable weapons, though let's test them out to understand their true effectiveness. We know that even a wooden club would have been deadly. This can clearly be seen by simply destroying fruit. But the large stone blades provide a cutting ability that makes the club substantially more deadly. The large bladed club cleaved its way through the pork and into the wooden stand. This large spiked club easily penetrated through the meat, leaving the massive projectile lodged inside. Even a simple wood-bladed club was able to cut through the meat to some extent. Clubs were clearly devastating weapons that took many souls at Naturuk. Now that we have a good understanding of the remains found at Naturuk, let's talk about the significance of the site. Naturuk has forced us to rethink our understanding of the role of violence and conflict in hunter-gatherer societies. The idea of large-scale violence in prehistoric times is hotly debated, and many thought agriculture was needed for organized warfare. Naturuk challenges this idea. It suggests that humans were capable of mass violence long before farming in cities. The evidence strongly suggests that 2 groups fought a perilous battle that extended beyond simple conflict, as clear cruelty can be seen in the remains. By understanding what may have motivated such cruelty so long ago, we can even gain an understanding of ourselves. Let's consider three main hypotheses about the site. First, the site may represent a simple raid for resources. Perhaps a rival group wanted what they had. 2. Perhaps the conflict occurred over territory rather than material possessions. 3. Conflict occurred due to some deep ethnic tensions or over a personal dispute. The people who lived at the site of Nataruk lived on the fertile shores of Lake Turkana. They had an abundance of fish to catch, animals to hunt, and plants to collect. Even evidence of pottery at the site suggests that these people may have stored some of their food and perhaps were less mobile than truly nomadic hunter-gatherers. It is possible that a group of outsiders raided them to take the resources they may have stored in these pots, and possibly for other material possessions, and possibly even for women and children. We know that in agricultural societies, the food stored in pottery and by other means were a major motivation of conflict. It is possible that this raid may represent the origins of materialistic conflict. However, we must also consider the value of the territory itself. Hunter-gatherers can be exceptionally territorial, especially if a certain area is particularly productive. The site of Nataruk was located at a part of the Turkana Basin with extensive beach access on a shallow shore, perfect for spearfishing. But the surrounding regions were not as productive. To the east and to the north were the deltas of the Kirio and Turkwell River. These regions were forested and would have been more dangerous for predators and rival groups. Nataruk was therefore located at some of the best hunting and fishing grounds of this area of the Turkana Basin, a land worth fighting for. The attackers were using obsidian, which was rare to the region. This may suggest that they came from different regions or perhaps in search of territory. The last explanation is that the conflict occurred due to an ethnic or personal dispute. Even 10,000 years ago, very distinct cultures undoubtedly formed, and ethnic tensions were undoubtedly present. If you look at the wars that have occurred in the past century or so, arguably a majority of them were caused by complicated ethnic and cultural tensions rather than just simply territorial or material motives. Evidence for such an ethnic or personal dispute may be evidenced by the sheer brutality of the site. Men, women, and children were killed without discrimination. None of the children were found anywhere near the men, suggesting they were attacked separately, and considering they were quite young, it is hard to imagine that they were resisting with considerable force. Furthermore, one of the women who had a 6 to 9 month old fetus had her hands bound and met her tragic end. It is clear that there was no quarter given by the attackers. This may provide evidence for the third hypothesis. Of course, the attack was likely motivated by all three hypotheses to some extent. To further understand the motivation for the devastation at Nataruk, let's look at other evidence for violence at surrounding sites. There are other examples of violence from the Turkana Basin from this time. 3 cases have been found involving projectiles, which are indicative of intergroup violence. 2 of the 3 cases also include projectiles made of obsidian. It is possible that these attacks were carried out by the same hostile group from elsewhere. At the very least, it is evidence that attacks happened in multiple instances in this relatively small area. It is possible Nataruk is the culmination of years of back-and-forth violence and hatred between groups. However, the individuals that were slaughtered don't show evidence of prior violence. It is possible that the victims had no idea who these people were, and they were treated without mercy all the same. A very important site to consider, though not nearby, is the Jebel Sahaba graveyard of the Nile Valley. This fascinating site contains a total of 58 skeletons between 12,000 to 14,000 years old. 23 of the 58 skeletons have evidence that they died violently, 21 of which had projectiles associated with their remains. The evidence suggests that conflict was fought almost exclusively with projectile weapons. This mostly consisted of light arrows, though also heavier weapons, possibly javelins. The lesions found on the skeletons suggest that the goal of these projectiles was to cause blood loss, and it is also impressive that many of them are found within the skeletons, meaning they penetrated deeply. The lesions are found equally anteriorly and posteriorly, which is indicative of raids and ambushes rather than face-to-face battles. This site was originally interpreted as the result of a single battle, but the healed and unhealed lesions were found to strongly suggest that it was the result of reoccurring violent encounters between social groups. The remains were also intentionally buried all in the same position, and their graves had grave goods and stone slabs covering them. It is clear that this site was repeatedly used as a cemetery. It may suggest that these people were somewhat sedentary or spent much of their time in the same area, as they repeatedly brought their dead to the same place. Some of the graves contain multiple skeletons and might represent individual violent encounters, after which the dead were buried. So rather than a violent event like at Nataruk, it represents reoccurring violence. The stark difference between Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba makes Nataruk even more unique. Jebel Sahaba perhaps represents what we might expect when we're thinking of prehistoric violence: small-scale raids and ambushes between groups, while Nataruk is something else entirely. It is evidence of a single catastrophic attack that could have been the final result of years of violent conflicts and ethnic tensions. A crime against humanity that would unfortunately not stand alone in our long and storied history. The site of Nataruk forces us to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth: that violence, even in its most depraved form, is not a modern invention. Conflict is certainly as old as humanity itself, but even war or mass casualty events existed long before the rise of agriculture, cities, or organized states. This challenges the idea that large-scale conflict only became possible when societies were large and stratified enough to stockpile resources worth fighting for. The violence at Nataruk appears to have occurred during a time of plenty. This suggests that the motivations for violence may not have been purely materialistic, but perhaps rooted in deeper territorial, social, or even ethnic tensions. This brings up a larger and even more complex question: is violence an inescapable part of human nature? Famous philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued that conflict is inevitable due to the fundamental nature of human beings. In Leviathan, he describes the state of nature as a condition where individuals, driven by self-preservation and competition for scarce resources, exist in a state of perpetual conflict, what he famously calls the war of all against all. Scientist Jared Diamond wrote about the state of nature in his book, The World Until Yesterday: What We Can Learn About Traditional Societies. In a passage, he wrote, "Most small-scale societies, instead of being peaceful, live in a state of chronic war. When I first arrived in the New Guinea highlands in 1964, I was witnessing what was considered a relatively peaceful period. But even then, I was seeing dozens of killings per year in an area with a population of only a few thousand people." His observations reinforce the idea that warfare and violent conflict are not exclusive to complex stratified societies. It may be true that organized violence and conflict has been a persistent feature of human history. Another uncomfortable aspect of the Nataruk site is the sheer brutality of the attack. This was not a battle between noble warriors. Men, women, and children were struck down in a one-sided rampage, their bodies left unburied. This was not just violence, it was genocide. But what could have brought hunter-gatherers to act in such a cruel fashion? The political scientist Helen Feen wrote, "Genocide is preceded by the dehumanization of its victims. They are seen as pests, vermin, or diseases to be eradicated. Dehumanization is what allows one group to see another one not as fellow humans, but as obstacles, threats, or even enemies." Perhaps the attackers at Nataruk had utter disdain for this group and had dehumanized this band to the point that such an attack was acceptable. We see this pattern repeat throughout history. When people are reduced to an other, whether through ethnic, religious, or ideological divisions, violence becomes easier to justify. Nataruk was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a pattern that would be repeated on battlefields, in cities, and across continents for thousands of years. If Nataruk can teach us anything, it is that the origins of intergroup conflict isn't just motivated by what one group can materially gain. Factors such as ethnic tensions and dehumanization may be just as deeply rooted in the human psyche. Understanding the origins of conflict gives us the ability to mitigate it, to find common ground, and to remember that no matter where we are from and what culture we come from, we are all human first. Because as history has shown us, no matter the era, no matter the place or the people involved, war never changes. Thanks for watching. What are your guys' thoughts about warfare and the origins of conflict? It is a very interesting topic, and it is something that I am seriously intellectually curious about. Like, I want to compile a bunch of sources about the topic and really get a deep understanding of, conflict in hunter-gatherer societies, the origins of warfare, and, the larger implications for humanity as a whole. There is so much information to consider, and I hope to get a lively discussion in the comments section about it. Also, I want to mention that I'm launching a Discord for the channel. So Discord is a platform where you can go on and talk to your friends and stuff, but I want to use my Discord space as a place where we can actually have good conversations about, topics like warfare and the origins of violence, and we can share sources and actually get to the bottom of some of these very interesting questions, because, I usually write these videos just on my own, but having different people to consult and talk about and share ideas and share sources, importantly, is a really cool idea. So go check out the Discord. The link is in the description. Okay, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you're always notified when I upload a new video. This has bin your host, North02, and I'll see you in the next one. Arrivederci.